Thank you, Clay. I'm not going to take too long to introduce our panel because I also am under strict orders to keep my comments to a minimum and not take too much time. Let me introduce, not in the order in which they'll speak, but in which you can see them on the podium from the left. First is Professor Warren I. Cohen, Distinguished University Professor of History and Presidential Research Professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, as well as Senior Scholar with the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. He is a historian of America's foreign relations and has published 18 books. Is that right? 18 books, which include East Asia at the Center, 4,000 Years of Engagement with the World, as well as the very well-known America's Response to China. Then, June Teufel Dreyer of the University of Miami. She's a professor in the University of Miami School of Business. Her research focuses on Chinese politics and defense issues. She's currently at work on a study of Sino-Japanese relations. Professor Dreyer's public service includes work as a commissioner of the congressionally established United States Economic and Security Review Commission, also service as Asia advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, and a stint as Senior Far East Specialist at the Library of Congress. Then Harry Harding is University Professor of International Affairs at the George Washington University, also counselor and chair of the China Task Force at the Eurasia Group, a political risk advisory and consulting firm headquartered in New York, also currently visiting fellow at the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society, also in New York. Specialist on Asian affairs with a particular interest in China, he's the author of A Fragile Relationship, the United States and China since 1972, and China's Second Revolution, Reform After Mao, which came out in 1987. I think I read that 4 or 5 times when I was in graduate school. And then finally, Dr. William Overholt of RAND. He holds the Asia Policy Research Chair at RAND's Center for Asia-Pacific Policy and is director of the center. He has long been an important analyst of Asia. Dr. Overholt is the author of the forthcoming America and Asia, The Coming Transformation of Asian Geopolitics, to be published later this year by RAND. Also, the very well-known The Rise of China, published by Norton in 1993, which won the Mainichi News Asian Affairs Research Center Special Book Prize. And I want to start now with June Teufel Dreyer from the University of Miami. Dr. Dreyer will talk about U.S.-China relations, engagement, or talking past each other. June.
Thank you, Dan. And one of the very nice things about being invited to conferences like this, for which I thank the sponsors, is that it forces you to put together in some kind of coherent way things you've had kind of rattling around in your mind for a long time. And it occurred to me as I was rereading the paper in the plane yesterday that the title may not be mutually exclusive. In other words, U.S.-China relations, engagement, or talking past each other. And it is possible to imagine that the basis of our engagement is our ability to talk past each other. But anyway, the paper begins with several instances of our talking past each other on a variety of issues, intellectual property rights, and we complain, the Chinese say we're working on it, and we say how long do you plan to work on it before you solve it, and the Taiwan issue, the military issue. China says it's a friendly elephant, it needs time to develop its economy. And we say, but what about those rapid increases in your military budget? What are your motives? We want transparency. And the United States says, well, we understand your need for oil, but why do you have to get it from these rogue regimes that have absolutely scandalous records on human rights? And the Chinese answer back, remember what happened when we tried to buy CNOOC, an American oil company? And nationalist hysteria in the United States forced the cancellation of the deal. So this has been going on for some time. And in fact, I think you could say that the United States-PRC relationship was founded on talking past each other, and particularly on the issue of Taiwan. And the reason for this is so that the United States and the PRC could come together on what they considered a larger issue, and that is the common fear of the Soviet threat. So that other issue is pushed to the side. And when the normalization issue was finally solved, largely by talking around the Taiwan issue, Sino-American relations entered a very good period in the 1980s. To be sure, there were, from both sides' point of view, setbacks. And in the United States, we held forth great hopes. This was the era of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, and economic pluralism was going to bring political pluralism, and the China was going to be a democracy. And to be sure, there are these setbacks. Democracy wall is closed, dissidents are incarcerated, things like that. And we kind of had the attitude that, all right, this is 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. In the fullness of time, these problems are going to be solved. And even Taiwan and China appear to be getting along nicely in this period. Well, what happens? We've all heard this, the phrase, expect the unexpected. And lots of things that really were not predictable and really were only tenuously related to each other happened. Most of these you already know. First of all, the Tiananmen incident in 1989. This is, for many people, the demise of cuddly communism. All of a sudden, the cuddly communism looks like the iron fist inside the velvet glove. And second, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This really removed the raison d'etre, the original raison d'etre of the United States-China relationship, and from China's point of view, put it in a very uncomfortable position. China had been really good at playing off the United States against the Soviet Union, and now it's confronted with a sole superpower, which makes it very uncomfortable. Third is the Gulf War, the 1991 one, and from China's point of view, the sole superpower is acting like a great bully. This is followed along by Kosovo, which is even worse from the Chinese point of view, because Kosovo was interference in the sovereign rights of a generally accepted political entity. And the United States is making the argument, it wasn't even a UN operation, it was a NATO operation. The United States is saying human rights trump sovereign rights when the two come into conflict. And the Chinese can see this being used against them because the sole superpower may decide to defend the human rights of Tibetans and Uyghurs. And another thing they consider their domestic affair, which is Taiwan. So that's a third factor. A fourth factor, again, not completely predictable, Taiwan became a democracy. Democratization involved necessarily Taiwanization. A small mainlander clique had dominated the politics of Taiwan. Democratization means that the people of Taiwan, the native-born people, gain a voice. And it also meant that since they have very few emotional ties to China, they are less interested, in fact, sometimes militantly uninterested in unification. And another thing that being a democracy meant is that it was much harder for the United States to let go of its support of Taiwan and its support for Taiwan's continued separate existence. And as shown by Warren Christopher's, at least in hindsight, incredibly unwise decision to give the Chinese his personal assurances that Lee Teng-hui would never get a visa, somehow forgetting that Congress controls the State Department's budget. And he had to back down on that, and it made the United States look untrustworthy to China. And so Lee Teng-hui goes on a triumphant visit, and the Chinese begin a year of war games and missile firings in the Taiwan Strait, and we begin to see that this has the potential to be very, very damaging. Okay. Now, a fifth development, which was not so unpredictable, although certainly the speed with which it happened came as a shock to many people, was the rise of China to be a great power. And this, you all know about the impressive economic advances. These are accompanied by even larger increases in the defense budget. And all of a sudden, people begin to get very wary. US businesses were eager to do business in China. and they thought, oh, we will sell our products to the Chinese market. And all of a sudden, they begin to see American consumers are buying Chinese goods. At first, lower end of the technology spectrum, lower value added, then higher and higher and higher value added. And so this isn't what they expected. China was also seeking out new markets, both for raw materials, particularly energy. David Zweig will tell you more about that, and I have an article on it coming out in Zhao Suisheng's excellent Journal of Contemporary China. And it needs this raw materials, it needs energy in particular, and it also needs outlets for its products in markets that the United States and former colonial powers had considered their turf. And if you think the United States is nervous, you should talk to folks in France who are willing to be frank with you. I have a friend who does not wish her name used because she's in a sensitive position, but she tells me that there is real consternation in French government circles over what the Chinese are doing in Africa. Now, in other words, their market share is being cut in on. These countries, the African, Latin American, Southeast Asian countries, are delighted to have China. It gives them leverage against the United States and the former colonial powers. And they point out that China does not moralize. They're not scolding about liberty, equality, fraternity, and human rights. And meanwhile, United States trade deficit is growing larger and larger. Their intellectual property rights are being hugely violated, over 90%, some people say 95% of violations, and also violations in proliferation. And United States is seeking new bases for Sino-American relations, and they come up with, we need to integrate China into the global community, and later on we need to make China a stakeholder in the global community. And it seems with very little thought being given on the US side, at least publicly, to if we want to integrate China into the community and make it a stakeholder in the community, is China going to do this passively? Which seems like an insane assumption. You know, if China's going to integrate into the global community, surely it wants some say over the rules of the global community. And similarly with stakeholders. China is said to be, Bill Clinton wants China in the World Trade Organization. This is a bipartisan thing, so do a lot of Republicans. And Bill Clinton says, WTO entrance is a poison pill for China. Never were untruer words spoken. Well, maybe, but at least it's right up there. Okay, but the trade deficit with China grew, and Clinton administration officials later admitted they knew it would. And Clinton was also saying, okay, this is going to be democracy. I was reading a very interesting thing from Brookings a couple of days ago that said that Clinton was gambling on the fact that the WTO would change China faster than China would change the WTO. And since it's a very judicious publication out of Brookings, it didn't say, ha-ha, it didn't happen that way, but ha-ha, it didn't happen that way. Okay, what do we do? There's been a flood of oratory about this. You've heard about integrate China, make China a stakeholder. There's also, some people say what we need is engagement, or maybe what we need is congagement. Other people say, well, you need to adjust to China's greater power. Some people harp on dialogue, the need for dialogue, and other people say ponderously, we need to manage problems. Now, the problem is, all of these sound good. They are morally and ethically unassailable. But the problem is they don't give you any guidance really on concrete issues. How do we solve these concrete issues? From the US side, this search for solution is compounded by a lack of consensus domestically on what to do about specific problems. So trade deficit, okay, everybody says it's a problem. Schumer-Graham comes up with 27.5% increase in tariffs unless they revalue their currency to a reasonable level. And immediately other people say, but what about Walmart customers? They really like the cheap prices. And besides, China buys lots of T-bills. And if they're stopping buying their T-bills or dumping their T-bills on the market, it's going to increase the US inflation rate. And boy, is it going to make it hard for the already depressed home buying industry to become it's going to make it worse. So there's that. Then there's the military buildup. And in the paper, you'll see I have two admirals vigorously disagreeing on what our reaction to this ought to be. One of them says if the Chinese Navy is going to demolish our fleet in a couple of years, and others say, yeah, nothing to worry about, that sort of thing. Now, to be sure, our efforts to talk to or past the Chinese have had some solutions. Drug enforcement, we've interdicted heroin shipments. There have been some interdiction of nuclear materials, though this is far from perfect. There's been a slow appreciation in the value of the Chinese currency from 8.3 to the dollar to 7.7, I think is the latest figure I've seen. China joined FutureGen, which is an energy saving issue, cooperation scheme with the United States that if it works, will make much cleaner energy and hopefully reduce not only the amount of environmental pollution, but also the need for more energy. So I'm not sure. I considered using the North Korean example and the Sudan's apparent agreement to have peacekeepers, but I'm not sure these can be considered successes yet. I'm keeping an open mind on this. Now, critics of this will say these successes tend to cluster at the low end of Chinese issues, of American issues of concern. In other words, heroin interdiction is good, but it is not what we're really at here. So now, maybe you could say, so far, talking past each other has worked tolerably well. To some extent, each side is also talking past domestic constituencies, and it's important to be able to circumvent this. Also, there might be a back channel through which they're probably communicating, and maybe they're communicating better than we think on the public record. Now, what about the future? We've seen how unpredictable factors have affected the past, and they are apt to have a similar effect on relations in the future. I'm going to have to talk even faster. Dan tells me I have 2 minutes left, and this is, okay, I have some advice here. There are a lot of unpredictables, such as American willingness to continue to be the dominant actor. So China's multipolar world order that it really wants may well come about. And we don't have any assurance. Oh, you say 3 minutes. Can I go with her? Anyway, so China may be able to keep up sustain its current level of economic and military growth, but maybe it can't. And also we see some of these states performing balancing operations. And there's a lot of evidence here that even though these countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, they're happy to have the United States. China counterbalance the influence of the United States or France or wherever, but they're also worried their economies may get swallowed. South Africa, just to give you an example, which isn't in the paper, but this beautiful African cloth that so many of our African Americans wear to functions, this kente cloth, has been machine copied and computer machine copied in China and can be turned out at far lower prices than the Africans can consume it, and it's being sold in Africa. And it's driving traditional industries out of business. And in Latin America, my backyard, so to speak, in Miami, we find that Brazilian soybean producers who were thrilled to have Chinese market are now consulting with American producers for how they can circumvent Chinese pressure on soybean prices. And a delegation from the Mato Grosso went with Americans to scope out the Indian market for soybeans just to get around this. Okay, now what? And what should we do while we wait for these variables to point out? This is the last page. One, beware of the orotund cliche. I was flabbergasted during a code word briefing by an operative of that agency whose name cannot be spoken, that to hear her say, as China regains its rightful place in the world. Oh my God, this is supposed to be an objective analyst? And elsewhere, the 21st century will be the century of China. No one would claim that any other past empire deserves to reclaim the glories of past conquest. Have you ever heard that Italy is entitled to the possessions of the Roman Empire? Or that it's inevitable that the Iranian government should someday administer the lands ruled by Cyrus the Great? Probably you haven't. And moreover, I would argue that the 21st century doesn't necessarily belong to anybody. A second thing, listen to what the Chinese is saying to each other. Another one of my pet peeves is the phrase, if we treat the Chinese as an enemy, they will surely become one. Now, this may look less convincing, again, keep an open mind on this, when you read Chinese military journals with their discussions of how best to defeat a technologically superior enemy with aircraft carriers and heavy reliance on network-centric warfare. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a category of one unless you assume they have France in mind. I don't think they do. And know that Deng Xiaoping urged Chinese to observe calmly, secure your position, be good at maintaining a low profile, and bide your time. And that Jiang Zemin argued that everybody knows dancing with the wolf is dangerous, but we've got to do it for some period of time. And ask yourself what happens after time has been bidden or boded or whatever, and that the wolf decides to stop dancing. Okay, so beware also of the security dilemma. You all know what that is. Countries that don't need to go to war escalate because they're afraid of each other, and pretty soon a war neither one of them wants happens. But also beware that the alternative may be even more dangerous, not reacting to buildups in military. There's also recognized that the United States can do a lot to improve its economic situation. A lot of this is our fault. We need to acknowledge it and work on it. And also understand that as much as we desire a democratic China, it may be a long time coming, and we got to live with that. Now, ultimately, the last word on this comes from China's ambassador to the United Nations, then Xia Zukang, and he says, China is neither heaven nor hell. It's just in the process of building a society with decent living standards. And to the extent that the United States can encourage this without jeopardizing its own living standards, it should do so. Thank you for your attention.